sorry for the delay. Washington has some little bit of roadblock for the Vice President, but he's here, and we'll start in just a moment. My job is simply to first start with a little safety announcement. We always do this with outside groups. If there's anything happens, you're going to hear a big voice, and I'm going to take care of you. I'm going to take care of the Vice President first, but I'll come back for you. If you see right behind me, these are the doors that take us to the exits. We're going to go down to the street level. We'll take 2 left-hand turns. We'll meet across the street at National Geographic. I've already ordered ice cream, and we will sing a song of praise for our salvation. We'll be just fine. I'm honored to have all of you here. I'm especially pleased, Emily Brzezinski. Thank you for coming. You know, this was an award that was made possible by the Smith-Richardson Foundation to recognize the many years of service that Dr. Brzezinski served on their board. And Zbig had only 2 stipulations. One was that it be awarded on a bipartisan basis. Last year we had Bob Gates, and this year, Zbig's request, it was Joe Biden. And the other, that it recognized someone that has been a leader with moral purpose. And it was probably the last conversation I had with Zbig when I told him that Vice President Biden had agreed to receive the award. And that will always be my enduring memory. The official host for this afternoon is going to be a very good friend of Vice President Biden, and that is Secretary Bill Cohen, Senator Bill Cohen. They served many years together. They were very close. They're both going to come out together, and Bill Cohen's going to have a few introductory words. But would you please welcome them both with your applause?
I assume that was for me. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for attending this very momentous event. I want to thank my dear friend, the former Deputy Secretary of Defense, John Hamre, who has now been leading CSIS for the past 17 years, hard to believe, but has made this center really the premier place to think about things, about serious issues. And has led it to incredible heights. So I want to be here to thank him as well and to recognize a few of my colleagues who are here. Senator Bill Brock, Senator Dick Lugar, Senator Bennett Johnson, among many others who are here today. I should point out that when I was elected to the Senate back in 1978, I was 38 years old. And when I went to the Senate, I looked around and I said, I need to talk to some really wise people. And I had a lot to talk to. I talked to many of them who were 20 and even 30 years older than I was at the time. And there were people like Howard Baker and Ed Muskie and Jack Javits and Chuck Percy and John Tower and Ted Stevens and Dan Inouye, Barry Goldwater, Bob Dole, Ted Kennedy, Abe Ribicoff, Senator Nunn, Senator Lugar, Senator Bill Brock, Bennett Johnson, Scoop Jackson, and John Chafee. Those were the people that I went to say, tell me how I can be a worthy member of this august body. There was one other senator that I turned to, and he had a unique feature about him. He was younger than I was. And so I found myself, this man had served 6 years before I arrived, and he was 2 years younger. And yet he wasn't young, no, he was young in age, but he was very old in terms of wisdom. And he and I got to be friends. I turned to him for many occasions, trips to the Soviet Union, then the Soviet Union to NATO headquarters and all over the world. And he was a role model for me at that time as another young man who was taking on big responsibilities. There's one word I tend to associate with Joe Biden, that's hope. And if I can quote from Emily Dickinson, She said that hope is the thing with feathers that perches in the soul. And it sings the tune without the words and never stops at all. Now, I think of that in terms of Joe Biden, because Chuck Hagel, another former colleague of ours and former Secretary of Defense, said if you ask Joe Biden a question, he'll give you an answer. And if you don't ask him a question, he'll give you an answer. Because he was born to talk and to teach and to lead. If you think about his life, 36 years in the United States Senate, he's had 8 years as vice president. I mean, that's a remarkable span of time and devotion to public service. And you know, we're reaching a point in our history where you have Yeats being quoted again. You can't have Joe Biden up on the stage and not have an Irish poet quoted, but about things falling apart the center can no longer hold. And while the best are lacking in all conviction and the worst are full of passion and intensity. And I say, well, you know, Yeats never met Joe Biden. He's not lacking in all conviction. He's full of passionate intensity. And because he is a lawyer by training, he would be mindful of what Benjamin Cardozo once said. He said, of our fiduciaries, our trustees, like those of us who are here, trustees of CSIS, they owe you something more, something higher than the morals of the marketplace. Something higher than the morals of the marketplace. And he used the words, he said, they owe you the punctilio of an honor, the most sensitive. And that really is what a trustee, that's what a public servant is obligated to reach, the punctilio of an honor, the most sensitive, higher than the morals of the marketplace. And I can say, if you look at Joe Biden's life, he's dedicated himself to measuring up to that standard. And when he was the United States Senator, he wasn't having chauffeured limousines take him home to Delaware. He wasn't flying in a private plane. He was on Amtrak every day, and because of his devotion to his family. And so I think of Cardozo talking about higher than the morals of the marketplace, because we've seen a coarsening of our society. We've seen a coarsening of it in terms of our language, in terms of our actions, in terms of our social discourse. And frankly, it's disturbing to all of us. And when I think of Joe, I said I think of hope, but I also think of the Greek word, which was arete. Arete meant nobility. Not of blood, but of purpose. Nobility of purpose. And that to me is what sums up Joe Biden's career, his life, and his mission. If you go through, you say, is there anybody in this room? Take a look around. Is there anyone in this room who's more entitled to be worn down and beaten and bitter because of sadness and grief than Joe Biden? Ask yourself that question. Is there anyone in this room, however, who has more joy of life and zest for living and hope for the future than Joe Biden? And so if you answer those two questions no, then you talk about character. You talk about arete. You talk about having a purpose, a moral purpose in this universe of ours. And so I didn't want to pass up this opportunity to say a few words of welcome, to say to my friend Joe Biden, former vice president, a man who has great conviction, who is passionately intense, and cares deeply about this country. And I couldn't be happier than to be here to at least participate in a ceremony and an awards representing Zbigniew Brzezinski and what he represented to all of us in terms of his public service, of dedicating himself to understanding the world and how it works and what our role in that world is. So, Vice President Biden, thank you for coming here, and thank you for being my friend.
You're next.
Over to you.
Thank you. Thank you. Please. 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 Good to see you, Brent. You all know that famous quote from Adlai Stevenson. He said, "Flattery is fine as long as you don't inhale." You know, all of you in this room have made enormous contributions to the well-being of the enterprises you've been engaged with. And many, many of you in this room have received honors and awards. And Mark, this is an award that means a lot to me personally, as you probably know, how I thought of your father. But I also measure an award based upon the degree of respect and admiration I have for the people presenting it. I will not take the time because it would take too long, but I have been a colleague, a friend, and a flat out, as Dick Lugar knows, an admirer of Bill Cohen. It's true he came a little later to the Senate, although he had been in the House. We learned of Bill's courage in the House during the impeachment process. This is a man with a backbone like a ramrod and a North Star that he has never, ever veered from. Ever, ever veered from. And so Bill, we've been close personal friends, but thank you for the comment you made. And when he started talking about the people we served with when we first got there, I almost started to cry, thinking, oh my God, what have we lost? But the reason Bill came to me after talking to all those senior people, he wanted to know how we were able to get on the senator's elevator. Because, swear to God, when I first got there, they'd say to me, no, senators only, when I went to ground. And Bill suffered the same ignominy. Madam Secretary, how are you? It's good to see you. Folks, he quoted Yeats, and my colleagues, including Bennett and others, used to kid me because I'd always quote Irish poets on the Senate floor. And that's because I used to stutter so badly, I practiced reading Irish poets because my uncle was a collector, so I wouldn't contort my face when I just stuttered. And but the real reason I quote Irish poets is they're the best poets in the world. And one who just recently died, who I had the pleasure of not only reading as Bill has and all of you have, but also getting to know a little bit, was Seamus Heaney. And he wrote a poem called The Cure at Troy. I had not planned on saying this. And there's a stanza in that poem that maybe make you think I'm naive, but I think best, he was talking about his Ireland, but best represents the state of affairs in the world today and the possibilities for America than it does describing his Ireland. He said, history teaches us not to hope on this side of the grave, but then, once in a lifetime, that longed for tidal wave of justice rises up, and hope and history rhyme. I believe with all my heart and all my soul that it's within our power, with a whole lot of hard work, some moral courage and sacrifice, and a little bit of luck to make hope and history rhyme. We have never been, in my view, better positioned to lead the 21st century, any century, than we are today. John, thank you for your leadership here at CSIS, and to the Brzezinski family, and to my former colleagues, including a great friend, Bill Brock, and you have You were a man of enormous integrity, Bill. And everything that you did demonstrated that. And I told Bennett, I said, Bennett, you got to get the hell back to Louisiana, man, we need you. He said, I gave you a governor, and he did. So it's good to see you, Bennett, and what a great family. I'm deeply honored to receive this recognition, and I only wish, like all of you, that Zbig were still with us here. Not just to have the pleasure of his company this evening, but because the foreign policy battles we're fighting today were ones about which Zbig was always the most passionate, and he passed it on to his sons. We need his voice and his vision today as much as we ever did. And it's not hyperbole to suggest that it's sorely missed. Zbig sometimes stood outside the Washington foreign policy consensus. But in my opinion, that's because he possessed a gift that few of us, few leaders, few politicians share: a sense of a grand strategy. He understood that American leadership rested on more than overwhelming military superiority. He saw our values, our respect for human rights, our involvement with international institutions for what they are: a source of incredible strength for our country. And he was never afraid to sit down at the table and talk with people with whom he disagreed, or work across the aisle with colleagues in the Republican Party. How many accomplishments can be traced to that one attribute he possessed: being willing to deal respectfully and thoughtfully, but firmly, with the opposing side and whatever the issue was. Normalization relations with China, Panama Canal treaties, Camp David Accords. The list could go on and on for a long time. You could write the book you probably have. The issue on which I worked most closely with Zbig was about the time when Bill came to the Senate. The SALT II treaty. Dick will remember this. I was just a young senator. Zbig was a national security advisor. But we both understood that arms control agreements with the Soviet Union were critical to ensuring strategic stability during the Cold War. And I remember when he and President Carter called me in, he was there, as was Ed Muskie, and asked me, he was then Secretary of State, he asked me to lead a delegation to Moscow. Remember, Dick? To meet with General Secretary Brezhnev and Premier Kosygin, to ensure that the Soviet Union would accede to the SALT treaty, even with some of, they weren't called conditions, but some amendments, additions to the treaty that the Senate had passed. And these fellows were grizzled hardliners. I was only 36 years old. Kosygin started and stated right off the bat what all of us in that room were thinking. The first thing he said to me, looked at me, he said, "When I was your age, I was leading the defense of the siege of Leningrad. Like, what the hell have you been doing?" to level set the field. And then he said, "Let's agree that we do not trust one another. And we both have good reason for not trusting one another." And he went through and explained why he believed that. It's a lesson that I've carried with me ever since, that the assumption of good intentions rarely extends to international diplomacy. But even in a world so ideologically divided, we still had time to talk and ultimately work together and ultimately pass the treaty. The risk of nuclear war was just too great and too high, the consequences unthinkable. Zbig also understood that even when it was a bipolar world, that the American people were safer with the United States leading a network of strong alliances. There was no greater champion of a rule-based international order and institutions we created after World War II than Zbigniew Brzezinski. He understood, as few others did, that the threat posed to that order by the politics of fear and factionalism. Not only did he live through an era defined by fascism and totalitarianism that he devoted his life to study. Looking back, Zbig was rather prophetic about this. Back in 2007, already bridling against the emerging culture of fear in America, nurtured by our long war on terror, this is what Zbig wrote. He said, "Fear obscures reason, intensifies emotions, and makes it easier for demagogic politicians to mobilize the public on behalf of the policies they want to pursue." End of quote. At the time, there were plenty of folks who dismissed Zbig as either being too alarmist or too naive. But 10 years later, those words seem prescient, eerily prescient. And add to that the emergence in that 10-year period of another source of fear, a sense of economic dislocation that is eroding support for internationalist foreign policy from inside out in Europe and the United States and other countries. Globalization has not been an unalloyed good. It has deepened the rift between those racing ahead at the top and those struggling, hanging on in the middle or falling to the bottom. Advanced technology has divorced productivity from labor in many ways, meaning making more than ever. We're now making more than ever, but we're doing it with many fewer workers. And we're now approaching, with Moore's law racing ahead and digitalization and artificial intelligence, a whole new brave world that nobody has figured out yet. Hardest speech I was ever asked to make, Dick, was at the World Economic Forum when I was asked to talk about the fourth industrial revolution. Will there be a middle class? Again, you might expect I'm more optimistic we can bend this revolution like we have every other one, but it's going to take an awful lot. But a lot of people are justifiably frightened. There's a shrinking demand for low-skilled laborers, with highly educated workers are getting paid more and more, and it's contributing to this rising inequity. It's not some plot on the part of bad guys and billionaires, but it's a reality. International trade, greater economic integration, has lifted tens of millions of people in the developing world out of abject poverty, improving education, extending life expectancies, opening new opportunities. But for many communities in the developed world that have long depended on manufacturing, the opposite is true. Their relative standard of living has declined, and it has. We have a shrinking middle class in America. Shrinking. For the first time since you or I have been alive, and most anyone in this room, fewer than 50% of the American people qualify. They feel shut out of opportunities, their economic security jeopardized. These forces didn't spring up from nowhere in 2016. They've been germinating for some time in our country, and Zbig saw them. Under these conditions, the appeal to populism and nationalism is a siren song, a way for charlatans to aggrandize their power, raise themselves up, break down those mechanisms that are designed within our Constitution internationally to limit the abuse of power and destabilize the world. Legitimate concerns about whether our children will be better off than we were and fears about the world outside our borders are being manipulated, like Zbig said, to mobilize the public on behalf of the policies, the destructive policies in my view, that will degrade our standing in the world and diminish our security and prosperity, in my humble opinion. Unfortunately, now we're just beginning to see just what these policies are. Bill and I had a moment to 3 minutes alone back there. We really worry that we're walking down a very dark path. It's not alarmist, but walking down a very dark path that isolates the United States on the world stage and as a consequence endangers, not strengthens, endangers American interests and the American people. During my 4 decades serving in high public office, I observed a simple truth. America's ability to lead the world does not only depend on the example of our power, but the power of our example. Not the example of our power, which is a necessary foundation, but the power of our example. For as long as I've been in politics, the United States has earned the respect of the world when we've led with our values. We haven't been perfect by any stretch of the imagination. We've made serious mistakes. But on balance, the world has looked to us, believing that we mean what we say, even though we always don't live up to it. And without them quoting Lincoln, thinking we are going to appeal and rise to our better angels. Our willingness, our set of values, set us apart by our willingness to advance not just our own interest, but universal aspirations shared by all people. We've invested in the success and security of others because we know it's going to benefit us as well. New markets for our products, new allies to deter aggression, new partners to meet increasingly complex challenges. Because of that, nations have rallied to our side, not by the use of coercion or fear on our part. They've come freely and willingly. We've built a remarkable network of alliances and partnerships. I would argue unique in human history. But today, around the world, including the United States, we're seeing a shift toward a theory of foreign policy that is closed off and clannish. One that groups the world into us and them. Rather than building a shared narrative of freedom and democracy that inspires nations to unite in common goals, this administration casts global affairs in a dog-eat-dog competition. Like it's a competition who gets that plot to build the new high-rise building. I'm serious about this. A Hobson's world in which, for America to succeed, others must lose, or a war against all. Among the many problems plaguing this administration's foreign policy, ideological incoherence, inconsistent and confusing messaging, erratic decision-making, unwillingness or inability to solve problems caused by understaffing. When's the last time at the State Department? You can stand on the 7th floor and yell and hear an echo. No, you think I'm kidding. It's irresponsible. It's this brand of zero-sum thinking that I find the most disturbing and dangerous. It's rooted, in my view, in a fundamental lack of understanding of the American stewardship of the liberal international order has returned incredible benefits to the security and prosperity of the American people and the rest of the world. An order that not only preserves our vital interests, but reflects and helps protect our core values. an order that's been supported for decades by leaders of both Republicans and Democrats. No one has protected it more staunchly than this man sitting right here, Richard Lugar. And that's not hyperbole. The president's vision, in contrast, is grounded on a disturbing admiration for autocrats and an apparent faith that the world will mistake bluster and bullying for strength. And it's built on an erroneous belief that America can go it alone without the support of even our closest friends and allies. To go to the United Nations, an institution founded following one of the darkest and deadliest eras in human history, an institution created with a certain knowledge that the future preservation of the world and its people depends on more cooperation among nations, a flawed institution. To stand in the well of the General Assembly and wave the flag of narrow nationalism while warning of a future vulnerable to, quote, decay, dominion, and defeat, end of quote, marks a dangerous revision of political small-mindedness that led the world to consume itself in 2 world wars in the last century. And it abandons America's hard-won position as the indispensable nation, as a leader that inspires more than fear. No one doubts our power. Nobody doubts our capacity. I'm confident Zbig would have had several elegantly composed paragraphs worth of thoughts on this issue. This is especially counterproductive, though, at this moment when we're dealing with multiple security crises that are at a boiling point. The actions taken by this administration are making it, in my view, harder for us to meet the challenges we face. And from what I'm reading in the paper, many of his key advisors think it might be making it harder as well. Challenge we face in undermining our credibility on the international stage by abandoning the Trans-Pacific Partnership, the Paris Agreement, questioning Americans' sacred commitment to NATO, repeatedly threatening to pull out of the Iran deal. This administration is calling into question what the word of the United States is actually worth. My dad used to have an expression, and Bill lived by it, and his dad did too, because we used to talk about our dads. You're a man of your word. Without your word, you're not a man. Simple proposition that applies to nations as well. The Iran deal is not between the United States and Iran, but with all the nations of the P5+1. First, to walk away from the deal unilaterally doesn't isolate Iran, it isolates the United States of America. Furthermore, the International Atomic Energy Agency continues to verify that Iran is complying with the deal. The Trump administration has already twice certified Iran's compliance, and for all its misbehavior, and there is misbehavior in other arenas, Tehran is holding up their end of the nuclear agreement, which, by the way, does not prevent us from taking any action we need to take about the other dalliances they're engaged in the region. Even Secretary Mattis has now testified to Congress that it's in the national security interest of the United States to remain in the Iran deal. One of the reasons I was late coming up, I was listening to the news, trying to determine whether I heard it correctly, that the president is announcing that next month he's going to pull out of the deal and, quote, leave it to Congress. Great American notion. And once again, Zbig had it right. Without the Iran deal, Zbig said, the obvious alternative is escalating chaos, possibly complicated by further and potentially more significant regional war. With some of the critics of the agreement, which some of the critics of the agreement seem to be advocating without much concern for its consequences. If we walk away, there'll be nothing to prevent Iran from resuming its nuclear ambitions. I won't go into all the details. You're probably the only audience in America I could talk to and knows the details and how far away and so on. I won't go into that. But in its time, we're not going to have, next time, the world on our side. Now consider the secondary effects of abandoning the deal would have on escalating crisis that exists in North Korea. North Korean leaders would have, they may have none now, but they'd have virtually no incentive to sit down with the United States, China, or other nations and negotiate a diplomatic resolution. If we go back on our part of the agreement with Iran, and while some good steps have been taken at the UN to ratchet up global pressure on North Korea through sanctions, the president himself has repeatedly undermined that effort, saying, my team is wasting their time. That's encouraging. Brent, you would have loved that being sent off and the president saying, by the way, he's off doing this, but he's wasting his time. I was joking about a kid I used to know on the east side of Scranton who used to say, who would have thunk it? Trading insults, deploying taunting nicknames, promising to, quote, totally destroy a country of 25 million people. Such erratic action only worsens the crisis and rejects the possibility of diplomacy and actively increases the risk of conflict. We should never, in our administration we didn't, in the previous administration, we should never hesitate to use force to defend ourselves or our allies. We must understand that a preference for a military option is a preference for war that could kill untold thousands of Koreans and Americans. We'd be far better off pursuing the kind of diplomatic strategy that prevented a nuclear conflict for decades during the Cold War. Effective diplomacy in close coordination with our allies, backed by strong, credible deterrence. There is no easy solution to this issue, but there's absolutely no room for miscalculation. President Trump's America First sloganeering isolates us in the world in a moment when few, if any, of any today's threats can be met without international effort. Grounded in mutual interest, mutual respect, but most importantly, shared values and shared need. Take, for example, the counter-ISIL campaign, the campaign President Obama and I put in place together with a broad coalition of allies and partners. The Trump administration, as most of you know, has essentially continued the plan because the same people who were in charge when we were there are the ones still in charge on the ground there. And it's being successfully carried out thanks to the courage of our troops on the ground and the continuation of an international effort. Yet around the world, a stable world order, the United States built to drive precisely this kind of unified effort when we're under attack, we're witnessing a concerted effort to decompose the community of democracies in favor of a more parochial international order, one where power, rules, and spheres of influence divide and weaken, or where the whole is decidedly less than the sum of the parts. This is no time for the United States to cede the field to the forces of illiberalism and intolerance. If we do, the liberal world order we've championed will quickly become an illiberal world order when we suffer. The world our adversaries will exploit for their own purposes. And that is, of course, why this illiberal movement is led principally by Vladimir Putin in Russia. Under President Putin, Russia is working with every tool available to them to whittle away the transatlantic unity and test the fault lines within among Western nations. We see it in their worldwide use of propaganda and false information campaigns. I know I got criticized when I was last with Putin and we were in his office alone. And he wanted to show me his magnificent office, and it was. And I had my arms up, I said, it's amazing what capitalism will do. And as I turned, we were coincidentally just about this far apart, looking at each other. And I said, and I wasn't being a wise guy, I said, Mr. President, I'm looking into your eyes, and you have no soul. And he looked back at me and he said, we understand one another. It's important to understand, not to threaten, to understand where the other person's coming from. They are sowing discord and inflame political divisions within democratic systems, strengthening illiberal factions on both the left and the right that question the benefits of NATO's collective defense or the EU's common market. We even saw their blatant efforts to influence and manipulate elections in Europe, as well as the United States, through cyber attacks and disinformation. Putin and his cronies seek to return to a world where the strong impose their will through arms, corruption, criminality, where weaker neighbors have not much choice but to fall in line without a unified community around them. This guy's not trying to reestablish the Soviet Empire. He's trying to decompose that liberal world order and the possibility of collective response and action to him. Dealing with 28 individual nations is a hell of a lot easier for Moscow, which is a declining power. A declining power. He's going to go down in the long history of his country as having ruined Russia. 145 million people unaware how to take advantage of the vast natural resources they have. I could go on and on. This is a declining power, but in a neighborhood where it is by far the most powerful. Nowhere is this more evident than the Kremlin's aggression against Russia's neighbors, especially Ukraine. Sending so-called little green men across the border to stir violence and stir separatism. Using energy as a weapon, threatening to cut off gas supplies midwinter and promising sweetheart deals with politicians who toe the Kremlin line. Using corruption to empower oligarchs and coerce politicians. These are the new tools in the quiver of foreign policy that is being used by Mr. Putin. He wants nothing less than to break apart the transatlantic community so he can more freely subvert the countries on Russia's periphery, like Ukraine and Georgia, countries that see their future in the West and can't figure out how to get there. Appeasement will not work. And so far, President Trump has been unwilling to call out Putin for Russia's meddling even in our own democratic process or criticize his actions. Think of that. Think of the signal it sends around the world, for God's sake. Fortunately, the United States Congress, led by Republicans, in this case, is not going to give Mr. Putin a pass. The huge bipartisan majorities Congress codified sanctions that the Obama-Biden administration had put in place and created new authorities for administration to apply more pressure on Russia. But the new sanctions authorized are not self-enforcing. They need administration to implement them. President Trump needs to listen to those bipartisan voices in Congress and the good counsel of his own administration who are advocates for this action, supporting Ukraine, pushing back Russia's meddling in Western democracies. And pushing back can be just merely identifying and codifying it, demanding accountability for Russia's brazen interference in our election. The world needs a strong democratic America leading the way in this and so many other issues. Only America combines enormous power with the extensive network of allies and partners, which is the key to rallying the world to address every pressing problem we face. And while we must continually reassess and retool our tactics to meet specific threats, our leadership should remain fixed in the values and ideals that have long formed the core of American identity. The same values and ideals implanted into the hearts of the liberal international order. We should reject the dark and counterproductive principles that this administration is leading with, principles more in line with illiberal instincts of nations like China and those who seek a world order where nations are not bound by common rules of the road. We have to place our democratic principles back at the center of our foreign policy. And that starts here at home, recommitting ourselves to the unending work of perfecting our own union, fighting for those truly exceptional American values: inclusivity, tolerance, openness, recognizing our diversity as, I believe, our greatest strength. We've gotten a cherry pick from every culture in the world over the last 200 years. People think someone sits in a hand-hewn table in Guadalajara with his family and says, I got a great idea, let's sell everything we have. Let's give it to a coyote to take us across the border, drop us in the desert, a country we don't know. Won't that be fun? Think of all who came and all those who came before you. They had courage. They had a sense of optimism. They were persistent. That's who the hell we are. Treating everyone with dignity without exception. Respecting the rule of law, modeling an unassailable commitment to freedom of speech and freedom of the press. I can tell you how to aggrandize your power in America as a president. Delegitimize the press first, and then question the integrity of the courts. Two of the institutions, one in our Constitution and one protected in our Constitution, designed to prevent the aggrandizement of power and the abuse of power. If we wish to see these democratic values take hold around the world, we have to ensure that it's America who first models them. These are also the values that we tie together with our closest allies and democratic partners, whom we depend to address every major challenge around the globe. Our partners have to believe that we're going to continue to stand with them, that we have to speak. We have to speak out when nations take steps that violate the rights of other people, even if those nations are partners in a particular enterprise that we share a security interest in. We can't. I think we can meet our national security imperatives without giving a green light to dictators, the abuse of universal human rights. We also don't seek to impose our values on other nations. We have to make it clear that such violations place inherent limits, though, on our cooperation with those nations. And we have to stand firmly against the powers that celebrate a retrenchment of American leadership. Make no mistake, without the United States standing as the bulwark of a liberal international order, nations like China and Russia will rush in to fill the vacuum of global leadership themselves. And here's one more thing that's for certain in my view. It takes a State Department running at full steam, where our career diplomats are empowered to do what they're trained best to do, to showcase American leadership and manage international challenges. Look, I don't want my remarks to end sounding as pessimistic as I've just sounded. I am extremely pessimistic about this operation, but I remain deeply optimistic about the future of our country and our capacity to lead the world. I'll end where I began. We are so much better positioned than any other nation in the world to shape the direction of the 21st century. We have the most productive workers in the world. That's not hyperbole. Our workers are 3 times as productive as workers in Asia. We have the most agile system of venture capitalism. We have the greatest research universities in the world. We have more great research universities in the world than all the rest of the world combined. Combined. It's because of a Republican named Eisenhower, who in the recommendation after Sputnik was to invest massive amounts of research money in the government. He said, I'll do it at defense, but it should be at our universities. We have all the resources and ingenuity necessary to overcome the challenges and create a better future. one that we all seek. But we can't let this current distractions prevent us from keeping our eye on the horizon as well. In the words of Zbigniew Brzezinski, if we slide into a pattern of just talking about today, we'll end up reacting to yesterday instead of shaping something more constructive in the world. And I, for one, am committed to doing everything I can, a small part I can play as a private citizen through the new Biden Center of Diplomacy and Global Engagement at the University of Pennsylvania to keep shaping something more constructive in the world. To continue defending and, where necessary, working to help amend the rule-based international order so it can continue to serve as the foundation for a strong and prosperous future for all our children. There have been people left behind by globalization and by digitalization, but there's answers other than throwing out the system. There are answers. There are things we can do. And if any place will generate the ideas of the things we should do, it comes out of this place. I apologize for talking as long as I have, but I really feel incredibly strongly that the women and men sitting before me, who have been the intellectual backbone of the foreign policy establishment in this country for decades, we have to start to speak out. President Obama and I have been very quiet and respectful, giving the administration time. But some of these roots are being sunk too deeply. I believe it's time to challenge some of the dangerous assumptions that are attempting to be replace that liberal world order. Thank you all. May God bless America. May God protect us.
You left me up here on the stage. You moved? Well, we can look across and see each other. And Janet says we are going to get together.
Thank you, everybody.
Yeah, she did.
Thank you for coming. Thank you very much.